From South Carolina to Oklahoma, Minnesota to Mississippi, this is American Radio Journal. On this edition, President Trump ignited a firestorm by suggesting the federal government build a 5G network. Ken Cuccinelli of FreedomWorks is here to talk about why the network should be built by private companies. We have team coverage of the federal budget deal. Andy Roth of the Club for Growth has the real story on the history of efforts to contain spending and why the deal breaks the spending caps of recent years. Eric Boehm of Reason magazine takes a closer look at what is contained in the budget deal and the policy implications going forward. And it's often called the deep state, career government employees frustrating elected officials' efforts at reform. Colonel Frank Ryan, USMC retired, has an American Radio Journal commentary. I'm Lowman Henry, and welcome to American Radio Journal. Private companies have been working on the development of a 5G network, so it came as quite a surprise when President Trump suggested the federal government might build the next generation of cellular communications. Here with the latest on the situation is Ken Cuccinelli. Ken is director of the Regulatory Action Center at the FreedomWorks Foundation. Ken, welcome back to American Radio Journal. Ken, we're going to have a discussion about the future of 5G in this country. So for those in our audience who might not know what we mean by the terms 4G network, 5G network, what are we talking about?
5G refers to the next level of technology for mobile phone networks. Most of the country is on 4G now. For instance, when you use too much of your data, they may pop you down to 3G. And in fact, there's still a little 2G left around. And each level of technology can carry more bandwidth and go faster. So obviously, you can do more and more dynamic things on such a network. So 4G being mostly deployed and still being put in place in some places, people are looking ahead to the 5G networks and what improvements we can expect. That's the difference from 1G to another.
In terms of the Gs that we've had so far, 2, 3, 4, have they all been developed privately, or was there government involvement in those development efforts?
No, they've all been developed privately. A good way to think of this is simply as an owned network. Let's take Verizon. Verizon builds their own network. The government doesn't build it for them. This isn't like roads, where the government, since the 20th century began, has really taken over building roads that used to be built privately. The internet and cell phone networks have never been built by government. Government builds its own, but they've never been built for the general public. And the comments about government building the 5G network were so shocking, in part because we know from history, one, it isn't needed, and two, we also know from history, government will slow it down and screw it up. So, and as a simple matter of philosophy, sounds like socialism.
You mentioned the comments that were made about 5G. Those came from Donald Trump. What did the president have to say that really shocked just about everybody?
Yeah, completely out of the blue, in an offhand comment, he said that it may be that the government should build the 5G network. Now, the main motive appears to be concern about a particular Chinese company that has been involved in building mobile phone networks in other countries and trying to exclude them from building any part of the American network. And the concern is a security concern that the communist Chinese would then have secret access to our entire mobile phone network.
As we look at the development of 5G, Ken, are American companies presently in the process of developing that?
Yes, they are. And there's an expectation that deployment would start probably in the latter part of 2018, and then into 2019, it would really ramp up. And by the way, the recent Internet Freedom Order put forward by the FCC and clearing out so-called net neutrality, which is, of course, not neutral, which would then ensure that builders of the internet and the 5G network will be part of that, would control their own property. Well, that's encouraged companies like AT&T to say, we're going to put billions more into the internet and into these new technologies. And if you were to then have the government step in and say, actually, we're going to do it, you'd suddenly lose a huge momentum toward innovation and investment that has leaped off the pages in the last 2 months. So the president really tripped over his own success, and they've walked it back a bit. But there are real reasons to be concerned about any prospect of the government building any part of the 5G network.
Well, talking about that Chinese company and the president's concern about cybercrime and cybersecurity, would there not be other ways that the federal government could block any potential security threat from getting involved in the development as opposed to just taking over the whole process?
Absolutely. Now, look, I run the Regulatory Action Center at FreedomWorks Foundation. We don't want more regulation. But if the choice is putting regulatory restrictions on mobile phone network construction or having the government build and own it, that's a no-brainer. We'll take restrictions over government ownership any day of the week. So a simple security restriction blocking the use of this particular Chinese company that they have security concerns about and forcing the use of other companies, particularly for computer chips that are used in the network, that's the specific concern, would be far better and would achieve far faster and cheaper and more efficient deployment of 5G than if government did it itself.
The FCC, as you have, Federal Communications Commission, as you noted, they did eliminate a lot of the so-called net neutrality rules that were put in place under the Obama administration, which is why, don't you find it puzzling that an administration that pushed for elimination of these regulations then would turn around and suggest that the government might get involved in what would be one of the biggest infrastructure projects in history?
Yes, the two are very much at odds with one another. And I do find that dichotomy very, I won't say discouraging, because I think that they have suddenly realized what a bad idea this is, and they're really getting knocked on their heels for it by people like you and me who've spoken up and said exactly what you just said. You did such a great job over here on freeing up the internet. Why on earth, 2 months later, are you tripping over that, really causing that to trip, and knocking down your own success?
We are talking with Ken Cuccinelli, who is, as he mentioned, director of the Regulatory Action Center that at FreedomWorks. Ken, tell us just a little bit about FreedomWorks and where can folks go to read more about this?
We are on the web at freedomworks.org. And, of course, our name is FreedomWorks because we believe that freedom works. We, at the foundation, there's also a C4 that argues on legislation, but at the foundation we fight regulations and try to educate people about that process and how much opportunity for economic growth there is by limiting the suffocating and anti-freedom regulatory direction that the federal government so often goes. That's what we spend our time doing. And again, we're at freedomworks.org. Would love to have people join us and sign up to keep up with what we're doing. We provide a lot of educational information and opportunities for actual involvement where you can have real impact.
Ken Cuccinelli of FreedomWorks. Ken, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
Andy Roth is at the Club for Growth, as always, in Washington, D.C. Andy, good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Lowman.
There has been, in recent years, a bit of spending restraint, at least on the part of congressional Republicans. Andy, it looks like maybe that's starting to come to an end. We have a so-called budget deal here that is going to break the bank. What in the world is happening? Are Republicans just giving in to the spending interests?
I don't know if they're giving in so much as that they're actively trying to help the special interests get what they want. A little background is necessary here, though. 2011, the Congress and then President Obama had a big fight about increasing the debt ceiling. And Speaker Boehner and Mitch McConnell and Obama had very extensive talks. And at the end of that negotiation, they crafted a deal that became known as the Budget Control Act of 2011. And what it did is set 10 years of spending caps that were put into place that would slow the growth of government. And the idea was that because of the financial crisis that happened in 2008, the country was experiencing trillion-dollar annual deficits. And this Budget Control Act was meant to tap down on spending because we couldn't afford to keep having those trillion-dollar deficits. That deal also raised the debt ceiling. At the time, the Club for Growth opposed that deal because we knew that Congress was not going to uphold the law. The deal was for 10 years of spending caps, and we knew that Congress could not handcuff themselves when it came to spending. We knew they were going to bust those caps. And so it passed into law despite our opposition, and the caps lasted for only a few years, and then Congress broke the caps for 2 years. Not the entire 10, but for just 2 years. And then 2 years later, they broke the caps again. And then now they're breaking the caps yet again for 2 years. Mitch McConnell, back in 2011, when he was praising this deal, he said that finally the big government freight train was slowing down because of those spending caps. Well, it's clear now that McConnell and the GOP establishment just want to speed up the big government freight train all over again with the help of big spending liberals on the other side of the aisle. So this deal is bad, and it is going to create chronic trillion-dollar deficits, according to one group, indefinitely. So this deal stinks. But unfortunately, that's what Republican leadership is pushing for.
As we look at this whole situation, Andy, I know there's been a lot of folks who have decried the partisanship and the rancor in Washington, D.C., but it seems like whenever there actually is bipartisanship and they get together, it's usually for some big government, big spending initiative. Is that what we're seeing here? The only way that the parties can work together is when they mutually raid the Treasury?
Well, that's exactly right. Back when partisanship was the norm, this was when Democrats completely controlled Congress from World War II up until the contract with America in 1994. And those were some pretty big spending times, and it was because of everybody agreed to just spend. This bill, you should see it. I mean, it is a Christmas tree of spending. They are going to increase, they're going to bust the spending caps. They're going to increase spending by $400 billion over 10 years, and they're going to, and I'm using air quotes that you can't see, they're going to, quote, pay for $100 billion of the $400 billion with gimmicks. Now, leadership will say that they're spending cuts, but they're not. They're just accounting gimmicks to pay for things, or they're one-time payments. So it's a bad deal. And then they add in a bunch of other things like disaster relief for the hurricanes and the wildfires that have occurred. They're not offsetting any of that money. And then they're going to extend a lot of tax extenders is what they're called, but they're basically, it's tax earmarks or pork projects through the tax code. They're going to extend those. They're going to expand eligibility for farm subsidies. They're going to reauthorize the S-CHIP program, which is a health care program, and they're going to eliminate caps on crop insurance for livestock producers. And to top it off, they're going to extend the debt limit conveniently through the midterm elections in 2018. So I find it incredible that there's a Republican anywhere that will support this, but unfortunately that's the case.
Anywhere in all of this orgy of spending that is about to occur, are they also looking at what has been touted as a major infrastructure investment project?
Trump has been pushing his infrastructure plan, and it's a $1 trillion plan. It's remarkably unclear how that is going to get paid for. So when Congress cuts this deal to create trillion-dollar deficits indefinitely, I will be very interested to know how they plan on paying for, if they decide to pay for it at all, for the infrastructure deal. So that's the next big issue coming up, so we'll find out what they plan on doing.
So all of this spending does not include what could be yet another big spending program. Andy, when it comes to Republicans, a core Republican message, and one of the ways that Republicans took control of the House, the Senate, won the presidency, was fiscal restraint. What does this do to the Republican brand as we head into the 2018 elections?
I don't know what it means to be a Republican. I thought it meant lower taxes, which is still true. I don't know that there's any evidence that it means fiscal restraint. So it's a problem, and it's why Republicans will continue to have difficulty at the ballot box if they continue to do things like this.
And, of course, we will track what is happening at the ballot box all year with Andy Roth at the Club for Growth. Andy, tell us a bit about the club.
Sure thing. The Club for Growth is a membership organization out of Washington, D.C., but we have over 250,000 members from all across the country, from all walks of life, from all 50 states in the Union, and we're united because we believe in economic freedom. If your listeners are interested, they can go to our website at www.clubforgrowth.org, and if they like what they see, they can join for free.
Andy Roth at the Club for Growth. Andy, we'll talk with you again next week.
Thanks for having me, Lowman.
For more on what is contained in the budget deal, we turn now to Eric Boehm of Reason magazine. Eric?
Look, I've said it before, and I will say it again. When the Republicans and Democrats in Washington agree on something, watch out. At least hold on to your wallets, folks. And that's why I had a sinking feeling earlier this week when I heard that Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in the Senate had reached a bipartisan budget deal to keep the government open for the next 2 years. Hi, folks. I'm Eric Boehm with Reason Magazine. Thanks for joining us on this edition of American Radio Journal. No guest for me this week. Instead, we're taking a look at the quickly coming together proposed 2-year budget deal that could very well, by the time you're listening to me, have already cleared the Senate and be on its way to the House and ultimately, possibly, on its way to President Donald Trump's desk. Now, this deal, at first glance, might seem like a positive one. After all, we've been lurching from near shutdown to actual government shutdown now for a couple of years. We haven't had an actual budget in a while. All of these continuing resolutions keep getting shorter and shorter so that the Congress is constantly facing one crisis after another. And quite frankly, that's no way to govern. It's no way to get our fiscal house in order. I want to see a budget deal. Congress needs to make a budget, but this budget, this proposal that we're starting to sort of get a look at the details of here on Thursday afternoon, looks like it is going to, quite frankly, bust the budget and the deficits wide open. And it wasn't all that long ago that Republicans cared a lot about these things. In fact, congressional Republicans spent most of the Obama years telling us just how dangerous rising debt and uncontrolled spending were going to be. So let's get into the details of this, the nuts and bolts. Don't want to bore you too much with too many numbers because the numbers here, they are big. They're difficult to comprehend. But the Senate bill would lift federal spending limits by about $315 billion over the next 2 years. That's what the Washington Post is reporting. The bill includes an additional $90 billion for disaster aid funding. You package all that together with $10 billion in infrastructure spending, a few billion more for federal health care initiatives, including $6 billion for opioid crisis responses. And when you add it all together, you end up with a boost to federal spending that totals somewhere around $400 billion altogether. It is, as Republican Representative Mark Meadows put it yesterday, a Christmas tree of spending that basically compromises on nothing and gives every member of Congress the one thing that they can all agree on, which is to spend more of other people's money. And Meadows, who I already mentioned, is one of the few Republicans who's actually coming out and saying the right things about this bill. He is, of course, the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, and other members of the Freedom Caucus are also giving you a straight conversation about what the bill means. Representative Justin Amish of Michigan, for example, called the proposal disgusting and reckless and a bit of fiscal insanity. Mo Brooks, a Republican from Alabama and another member of the Freedom Caucus, told The Hill yesterday that he is a no on the spending plan, which he described as a debt junkie's dream. According to calculations by Keith Hennessy, a former economic advisor to President George W. Bush, the bill would require borrowing about $1.7 trillion over the next 10 years to finance discretionary spending increases. The budget deal only covers the next 2 years, of course, but as Hennessy points out, and I think this is a very important point, you're going to see this become the new baseline for federal spending. That's how everything in Washington gets measured, whether you're going up or down from current spending levels. In other words, if you let this budget pass, the damage will linger with us for decades to come. And that's only one way that this bad budget deal could linger with us for a long time. Of course, borrowing $1.7 trillion over the next 10 years requires eventually paying that back. And this budget plan comes right on the heels of the tax bill that passed late last year. Now, I'm all for tax reform, and that was mostly a good bill, but it did also add to the deficit because the tax cuts included in it were not paid for. It was not revenue neutral. It actually added, even after you account for economic growth, about $1 trillion to the federal debt over the next decade or so. All of that is money that has to be paid back at some point. Tax cuts and spending today that isn't paid for just become tax increases in the future. And this bill has a lot of future tax increases included in it. Taking a step back from the numbers and the math for just a second, there's two big takeaways, I think, from this proposal and the fact that it's been introduced and is moving as quickly as it is through Congress with bipartisan support. First of all, it shows just how broken the budget process is. As the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget points out, the only thing that Congress seems to be able to agree on these days is to put hundreds of billions of dollars on the nation's already overtaxed credit card. That is exactly the wrong time for us to be borrowing money. We shouldn't be borrowing money when the economy is doing well. We shouldn't be relying on government stimulus when the economy is doing well. This is a time to engage in deficit reduction, a time to pay back some of the debts that we're already carrying. It's one thing to have $1 trillion deficit during a deep recession, although we could debate about even the merits of that, but to create $1 trillion deficit, and that's what will happen if this bill becomes law during a time of economic expansion, is, and I'm quoting here from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the definition of irresponsibility. It is a stunning fiscal picture and an unprecedented reckless path. But the second thing to think about here, the second big takeaway, is to take a look at who is crafting this proposal. This is, yes, a bipartisan deal, but it is one that is being written and passed primarily by Republican leaders in the House and Senate and with a Republican president in the White House. And so I'm just sitting here and thinking about all of the time and money and other resources that have been spent since 2008, since 2010, to elect Republicans to higher office, to get the House into Republican hands, to get the Senate into Republican hands, all of which happened because Republican politicians and would-be politicians across the country promised that putting them in office instead of Democrats would be a way to reduce federal spending, would be a way to get our debt under control and to get our fiscal house in order. And now what have they given us for that? Tax cuts, yes, but tax cuts that blew up the deficit to nearly unprecedented levels, and now a budget proposal, a 2-year budget proposal that promises to give us $1 trillion deficits and sets a new higher baseline for all future spending decisions to be made from. It is absolutely stunning to me that with Republicans in control of Washington, that this is the kind of proposal that could, in a matter of just a few days, become a new federal budget and one that will be paying back for a long time to come. We could go on, but unfortunately that is all the time that we have for today. You can check out more of our ongoing coverage of the budget debate and the long-term implications of what this budget bill could mean for the country's fiscal situation at Reason.com. For Reason Magazine, I'm Eric Boehm. We'll catch you right back here next week, folks, on another edition of American Radio Journal.
The civil service system was instituted to protect federal employees from political pressure, but the system is now being used to frustrate reform efforts. Colonel Frank Ryan, USMC retired, has this American Radio Journal commentary.
One of the greatest crises in our nation is the civil service crisis. This is a crisis in which the civil service is populated with bureaucrats with a political agenda versus a public service agenda. President George W. Bush and his White House Personnel Agency filled far fewer civil service positions than they were able to, and civil servants below the senior executive service were seldom political stalwarts. After Bush, the Obama administration, frustrated by its perception that its climate change agenda was being thwarted by political bureaucrats, found comfort in the University of Michigan study and used those results and the results of other such studies to populate governmental agencies with politically biased civil servants so that Obama's legacy could live on after he left office. That perspective during the last administration fundamentally altered the landscape of the politicization of governmental agencies. The Trump administration is dealing with the resulting swamp. It was during this Obama period that the politicization of the intelligence agencies and Justice Department occurred. In the past 10 years, the ranks of the IRS, FBI, Justice Department, and many of the intelligence agencies, such as the CIA, have become havens for political agenda versus a nonpartisan governmental operating unit and the rule of law. Obama focused on mid-level government employees protected by civil service rather than on political appointees who could be changed by the incoming president. The shift from nonpartisan to partisan governmental agency poses one of the greatest risks to our freedoms. The Plum Book is the reference book of the more than 7,000 senior executive service positions available for appointment in any administration. It is published every 4 years. To date, President Trump has only been able to get slightly more than 100 of his appointees approved. Below the position of senior executive service are thousands of mid-level positions that fall within the Civil Service Commission but are heavily influenced by each administration. This is the group that effectively runs the government, and once politicized, is virtually impossible to stop. It is the ultimate perspective on the swamp. The abuses and the politicization of government agencies, from the IRS to the FBI to the VA to the Department of Justice, are making headlines daily. Politics permeates almost all levels of the bureaucracy now, and the people spoke in 2016 that we want change. A year later, that fight to reform our government is even heating up. The Office of Personnel Management and Merit Systems Protection Board have reinforced a systemic protection of incompetency and bias at the expense of the American people. Both OPM and MSPB were designed to protect innocent workers, but now have morphed into bureaucratic pillars of incompetency and political gerrymandering of the workforce. For the period 2000 to 2014, 77,000 federal workers were discharged, or slightly over 5,000 per year out of a workforce of 1.847 million, less than 0.3%, which is well below the private sector averages. Our society is negatively impacted with such a system, since government services are frequently substandard or so highly politicized that the public confidence is eroded and perhaps even lost. Until the OPM and the Merit System Protection Board are reformed, until politicization of government by public service can be disciplined, the swamp will never be drained. The culture of accepting mediocrity and extreme bias at the highest levels of government must be broken. This does not mean that every government employee is a problem. Quite the contrary. It means that the burden of providing excellent government services is spread on the backs of those government employees who are, in fact, dedicated civil servants. Until we as a nation recognize that government employment is an honor and not a right, we will continue to be subjected to substandard or biased service by some, which casts the vast majority of outstanding civil servants in a bad light. To drain the swamp and restore our individual liberties, we must reform the OPM and the MSPB to deal with bias and incompetence rather than condone and tolerate such behavior. We must protect employees from political harassment, but more importantly, we must protect the public from incompetence in politics. Civil service laws were initially designed to protect against politically motivated attacks. Unfortunately, these laws have now become and provided shelter for the incompetent, the incapable, and the relatives of politicians the system was designed to protect against. These laws have been contorted to permit the takeover of government by politics at the expense of our liberties. Now is the time to provide protection for the competent civil servant and the public and our freedoms. For the American Radio Journal, this is Frank Ryan.
American Radio Journal is heard on public affairs-minded radio stations all across the country, including our newest affiliate, KWJZ-FM in Snohomish, Washington. Welcome to our new listeners in the Evergreen State. American Radio Journal is produced weekly by the Lincoln Institute of Public Opinion Research, Incorporated. The Lincoln Institute is completely funded through the generosity of individuals, corporations, and philanthropic foundations, which underwrite the costs of this program. Comments and opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Lincoln Institute or of this radio station. Learn more about American Radio Journal and hear expanded versions of some interviews aired on this program. Please visit our website, AmericanRadioJournal.com. I'm Lowman Henry. Thank you for listening to American Radio Journal. American Radio Journal, lighting the brush fires of freedom.